So now we're going to have a look at an M3. Strictly speaking, it's an oddity, but we're calling it an M3 hybrid because it's very similar to British and New Zealand tanks of the similar layout, and that's what I want to talk about. It's the interior that's really different, and that's the thing we're going to focus on. But just to start off, to explain why it's in this odd colour and with the markings on the turret, it was a gift of the Brazilian army to the Tank Museum. It was flown over here in a Hercules, and it's quite a remarkable survivor in many ways. It's in fact a pre-war American tank, but it's survived in quite good condition in Brazil. It contrasts particularly with the M3A1 because the M3 hybrid was a complete mess. The Americans were trying to come up with the M3A1 turret, which is why it's got that rounded turret on, and put it on an M3 hull. And the result was, well, a bit of a mess, really. The turret is a nuisance because it's controlled manually. It only rotates by manually turning a wheel, and that wheel is on the opposite side to where the gunner would operate. So the gunner's trying to stare through his telescope and expected to traverse the turret, but he can't reach it. So the other man, the loader, has to do that, and in doing so invariably gets it wrong, which is why the gun, it has about a 20-degree movement independent of the turret. So once the turret's more or less pointing at the enemy, you can adjust it a little bit at the top there, and it means that the gun's got a freedom of movement to left and right of about 20 degrees. Now, all of this was a nuisance. These were the first American tanks the British had any experience of. And what they found was that the most sensible thing to do is to actually drive straight at the Germans, firing as you go. In other words, keep the gun fixed in one position and drive towards the enemy. Don't get into a sort of melee where you've got to fire in all directions, because it's more trouble than it's worth traversing the turret. It was easier to swing the whole tank around, and that's what they did. They also used to reverse out of action, and the reason they did this was to keep firing at the Germans without traversing the turret again. And it looked rather odd. Everybody else turned round and scuttled for their lives. The old Stuarts were all going backwards out of action. So inside you've got a crew of 4 men, a driver who sits in here, a gunner who sits next to him, and then 2 men who are in the turret. But since they've got nowhere to sit, those 2 men, who are the commander and the gunner, are expected to stand in the back of the turret, which is okay if you're really fit, but I wouldn't recommend it. And it meant that when the tank went into action, the commander had to, who was in those days in the old M3 in a cupola, had to give up looking around and work entirely as a gunner. So he came down to serve the gun, and his mate, the gunner, became the loader, and that's literally how they worked in those days. It was very difficult to do, but the Americans had no real experience of tank fighting, and they thought it was quite a reasonable idea. It was only when it was exposed to the rigors of fighting in the desert that the difficulties were quite apparent, and that's how it worked inside. The tank was difficult to traverse, the turret was more trouble than it's worth to traverse, and they tended to keep the gun pointing forward if they could. It's an M6 gun, the higher velocity version of the gun in the early Stuart, which was shorter and tended to be just that little bit inferior in performance. But that's how it's arranged. And it really is a difficult tank to fight, because the commander, when he does want to look out, can only look out, he hasn't got a cupola, which the earlier tanks had. He can only look out through a periscope, and that was a limited vision anyway, so he couldn't see what was going on quite so well, unless he stuck his head out and probably got it shot off. It's got a Continental 7-cylinder air-cooled engine mounted upright in the back, and that drives down through the front, through the fighting compartment, to a gearbox in the front here. And what they've done is boxed in the drive shaft, so it makes a comfortable seat if you want to sit on it, but it's an obstacle for anybody trying to traverse the turret. You've got to gallop round after it and move over this thing at the same time, which is quite difficult to do. So they tended not to traverse for that reason. What they also had was, you'll see them, it's got machine guns in the sides here. Now those machine guns, there was one each side to begin with, were fired by the driver. They weren't like the lat gun, which could move about. They were fixed and fired by the driver. And they did away with the one on the right-hand side because they wanted to use the shelf that it kind of stuck out in on the inside for putting the radio in, which is what they did. They did try at one point to have seats installed for the tank commander and the gunner. And the only seats they could come up with were made of canvas. They were like a sling seat, like a swing, and you just sat the man on it. The only trouble was his legs didn't touch the ground and he swung to and fro with the movement of the tank, which nobody wants to do if they can help it. So that was very awkward as well. They suffered, as all the early Stuarts did, from a relatively short range. They had about 70 miles range, but that was only with a complete tank full of petrol. So the tendency was to use them in action without any fuel, or as little fuel as possible, until action was imminent. Then you topped up the tank and went into action, and that gave you the enough range to keep going through a battle. Otherwise it was almost impossible, actually, but that's how it was done. It's an awkward bloody tank to fight. They got an instruction from the armoured division in charge to remove the turrets and turn the tanks into recce vehicles. A lot of regiments were very upset by this because they regarded even the 37mm gun as an effective way of fighting people off. And with it missing, with only a machine gun or two, one on the top and one down here, they felt it wasn't enough. And in the end, they got the hang of them and began to use them, but the casualties went up, literally because the men were so exposed in the back. Once with the turret on, at least everyone's got some protection, and it's quite well armoured for its day. The armour on the sides is about 25mm, and on the front, say about 38mm on the front. So it made them a bit stronger to resist enemy fire, but not much. Again, you've got the problems of escape. For the driver, he can escape through the front hatch, but the loader normally goes out through the top of the turret, or his co-driver anyway. It's very undignified crawling out here, but if the tank's on fire, dignity doesn't come into it. The trick is to get out as quickly as possible, and that's how it was done. But the great thing about the Stuart and all that family was its reliability. The engine always sounded awful. It sounded spluttery and knocking, because it was really an aero engine put into a tank. But it never or rarely let them down. And when it was going flat out, it was quite remarkable. These tanks were really motor, and that was what was really their secret, was just the mechanical reliability of them, which is typical of American tanks generally. They were mechanically reliable, and the crews liked them for that reason. There is a story that a British soldier drove one and got out and said it was a honey, and from that came the nickname the Honey, which was applied to all the Stuarts at one time. The trouble is that honey is not a word the British would use in that context, really. Honey is stuff you spread on bread, and that was about the only thing people knew about it. Honey as a compliment is an American term, and it seems odd that a British soldier should come up with it, but that's what they say. If you believe it, you're welcome to. And that's the M3 hybrid for you. It's an odd tank, neither one thing nor the other. The M3A1 with the turret basket is much more effective, but that just took a little while to develop. For the moment, the M3 hybrid was all we had. Okay, now if you enjoyed that bit of film, or any of the bits of film we've made, if you'd subscribe to YouTube, that helps us a great deal, and more so if you'll support Patreon, because that's something that we really can do with. Thanks very much.